Shall I start?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, you can start.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Robin Hanson, an economics professor at George Mason University. I want to tell you about culture, but first, I want to tell you about civilizations. Civilizations have consistently risen and fallen through history, and that should make you worry. We're now in a civilization. Could the same things that have caused civilizations to fall in the past come to us and make our civilization fall? I'm going to suggest maybe yes. But let's first think about biology. In ordinary DNA evolution of biology, there are different size habitats. Some habitats are big, like oceans, and others are small, like coral reefs, rivers, tropical rainforests. And there's a difference between the species that live in these different kind of habitats. In the big habitats, their species have many members, but there aren't that many such species. Whereas in the small habitats, there are not very many members of each species, but a lot of species. So innovation within species happens better when you have a few big species, because an innovation can show up anywhere in the species and then spread to the entire rest of the species. There's more places for it to start, more places to spread. So innovation happens faster inside species that are big. But if you want innovation of species, of the features that define a species, that they can't vary very easily within the species, for that you want many species, and for that you have better innovation within the fragmented habitats. And it turns out that more life on Earth today descended from the fragmented habitats than from the big integrated habitats, suggesting that innovation of species actually matters more than innovation in species. Now, humans have been pioneering a new kind of natural selection. It is just natural selection, but the key difference is we can inherit behaviors and features from other people besides just our DNA parents. We can inherit them from our parents, from our uncles, from teachers, from the culture around us, and that allows us to spread innovations far faster and more flexibly, and that has been humanity's superpower. The main thing that makes us different from all the other animals is culture. And this process of cultural evolution, it needs something to copy preferentially. So if we just copied things at random, it really wouldn't help. We have to be copying the better models in our world in order for this process to make us better on average. In our world of intellectuals, the people who fight over culture, which ways they want to push it, are actually among our most prestigious intellectuals. But the people who analyze how culture works are among our least prestigious, and that's a problem because we have a key process here we're not paying attention to. Probably most distinctive human features evolved from cultural evolution. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
See?
yeah.
Okay, great.
You can see us properly.
Yep, I see you all. So, but culture still has this in versus of thing. And the word culture, when we use it, we usually tend to refer to the cultures, a culture, and we're usually referring to the features of cultures that have to stay the constant with culture, although cultural evolution as an academic field, it treats all human behaviors as culture. But when we have the culture section of a newspaper or something, it tends to be talking about the parts of culture that we share together, like a species would share features in ordinary biology. Now, to get our handle on culture, it helps to think about corporate cultures because they're kind of more visible and easy to see. Most firms die within 5 years, and even on the top list of firms in the world, the S&P 500, they only stay on there for less than 20 years. So, and most of the value in a corporation is in fact in its culture. If you look at tangible assets that you can see in a company and you try to explain that, to see how much of the stock price that can account for, it's only about 10% for the Fortune 500, the S&P 500. The rest of it is culture. So, and what's causing firms to go bad is their culture goes bad. And that's a big main fact CEOs know about their firms, and CEOs have strong incentives to try to preserve their firms and make them grow. So they're really interested in improving their culture and preventing it from getting bad. And Often they have what's called cultural change initiatives where they try to purposely, diagnose the problems with culture and fix it. And CEOs have a lot of power to do this. They can fire anybody, they can tell anybody what to do. And even so, these cultural change initiatives take 5 years, and 2/3 of the time they're said to fail. So it's actually just really hard to manage cultures, even when they're at the scale of a corporate culture that you can see and you're the person in charge and you can tell everybody what to do. Even then, the culture typically goes bad, and that's why firms die. And the only reason that on average corporate cultures are getting better is that we tend to be selective. And when we start a new corporate culture, we try to copy the best of pre-existing cultures rather than the average. But within a firm, on average, the culture goes bad. And some industries have a few big firms and others have many small firms. And the industries with a few big firms have better innovation within the firm, but industries with many firms have better innovation of the corporate culture. And again, of beats in, there tends to be more innovation in industries that have more smaller firms rather than industries that have few big ones. All right, so there's these two levels of evolution in DNA and in culture. And we're focused on this higher level because that's the harder level to handle, the evolution of cultures. And it's a control problem. So when you think of natural selection, the first thing we tend to think of is that it's a way of improving things, but its actual first task is to prevent things from getting worse. So it's like you're driving a car. It's a control problem. You're trying to stay on the road and not drift off the road. So there's a set of parameters about driving a car that affect whether you succeed at staying on the road. So there's how fast are you going? How wiggly is the road? How clearly can you see it? How much bumpy is the road or icy? How fast can you react to what you see? Those parameters, if in one regime, you'll stay on the road just fine, but in another regime, you won't be able to handle it and you will just go off the road. So natural selection is a process like that. It's a control process. Instead, you want to think that instead of just one dimension of control for the car, it's a very high dimensional space, maybe thousands of dimensions. And each of these is some feature of culture. And natural selection is you've got a cloud of points in this space, i.e. each of the different cultures. And there's some adaptive region here, the orange region. And within this adaptive region, cultures will grow and split. And outside the adaptive region, they'll shrink and die. And the task of this control problem is to follow the adaptive region and to have a cloud of points that stay around it. So parameters of this process are how many points you have, how high dimensional space, how strong is the selection effect where points inside the region grow and points outside shrink, how fast is this adaptive region moving, because the cloud needs to track it as it moves, and then just how fast are these points wiggling independent of everything else. In one regime of these parameters, it'll work. The cloud will track the adaptive region. But you can see as we make these parameters go bad and to another extreme, it'll fail. The points just won't track the region. And then since they're all outside the region, they're all shrink and die, and then the cloud will go away. That would be evolutionary failure. All right. So now we're ready to talk about macrocultures. We talked about corporate cultures as a small example, and that controls your behavior when you're at work. But macrocultures control the rest of your behaviors outside of work. They control your attitudes toward family and children and patriotism and love and death and all these sort of key aspects of your lives that control key behaviors in your lives. So 3 centuries ago, these key parameters were all in a good regime. So 3 centuries ago, the world had hundreds of thousands of little peasant cultures, each of which was near the edge of survival, with often wars and famines and pandemics. So that had a lot of variety. It had strong selection pressures. The environment was changing very slowly. So on average, say, a few centuries ago, the world economy was doubling every 1,000 years. So that was roughly the time scale on which there were big changes to adapt to. And those cultures were conservative. They were trying not to change. And they succeeded largely, only changing as much as needed to adapt to this 1,000-year timescale. Fast forward to today, first what happened is we smashed all these little peasant cultures into national cultures. We created nations, and then we've merged nations into a global monoculture. So there's a vast reduction in the variety of culture, far, far fewer points in the cloud. Secondly, we are now rich and peaceful and healthy, meaning fewer war, pandemics, famines. These cultures, few remaining cultures, are not getting killed off by selection pressures much. So the selection effect is way down. There's longer term fertility effects, but the shorter term effects are way down. The environment is changing much faster. So the world economy doubles roughly every 15 to 20 years now, rather than every 1,000 years. So this adaptive region is moving much faster, and so it needs to be tracked faster. And finally, we used to be very reluctant to change cultures, and then in the last few centuries, we switched to being very eager to change cultures, and as I'll talk about in a minute. And that makes these parameters all go to a worse regimes, which means we should worry that the cloud can't track the adaptive region anymore. The control problem isn't working. We're going to drift off the road. And notice that our leaders in macrocultures have far fewer incentives and powers to manage the culture to try to prevent it from going bad. So this theory predicts that we should be worried about the evolution of cultures, but notice that it predicts we should have great evolution in cultures. Because we just have a few big cultures, our innovation of things that can vary within them, like tech and business practices, that should be going great, and it is. The worry is about the evolution of the shared features of cultures, the key attitudes, again, toward death and patriotism and war and gender, etc. In particular, there was this dramatic transition around 1900. Up until that point, the world had been changing a lot in technology and business practices, but people didn't seem to think the culture was changing very much. And then all of a sudden, not only did they see the culture as changing facts, they were eager to cause cultural change. And this seems to correspond with the rise of high school, when we no longer had kids at their age of 14 or whatever, going out and mixing with adults and trying to be like adults. Instead, they formed their own teen culture. And then with college, that made stronger. And teen cultures create teen activists, youth movements. And that's been a strong driver of social change ever since 1900. And in fact, I did a little poll where I collected 100 times where the young and the old had a conflict, more than 50 years old, and asked who won in the long run. And apparently out of these 100 things, 96 of them, the young people won once the old people won, and the other 3 were ties. So youth movements are a really strong force for cultural change, but unfortunately they don't seem to be very aligned with these adaptive pressures. So from the point of view of this model I gave you, they're just ways in which these points are randomly wiggling. Now, what kind of changes should we expect? The simplest change to expect is a random walk in the space of possible cultures. We're just drifting away from wherever the adaptive region is, and it's moving away from where we were, so that the distance would be drifting. But there's also ways to expect predictable change over this period. And that's with the idea that humans were very adapted to their environment, say hundreds of thousands of years ago. And then with the rise of farming, we were able to adapt to the farming world because culture could change us. So culture forcibly moved us away from where our culture would have been naturally, according to a natural human nature, and it turned us into farmers with very different attitudes toward the world. And then a few hundred years ago, as the selection pressure started to weaken, we've been drifting back more toward natural human styles. So one way to think about that is if you think humans are naturally selfish, lazy, and myopic, then we would be drifting back toward that as selection pressures weakened. Another way to think about it is that we are becoming more forager-like, i.e., we were forcibly turned into farmers, and now we're drifting back to be more forager-like. And this can explain some trends in terms of more art, travel, leisure, promiscuity, less war, slavery, domination, fertility. Many of the trends over the last few centuries can be understood as us drifting back toward forager attitudes and habits as youth movements basically look inside themselves and say, what feels natural to me? This world around me doesn't feel so natural. What feels natural if I look inside myself? And they've been finding the forager self inside themselves and moving culture in a forager direction, which feels good to them, but there's no particular reason to think that that's adaptive in terms of functionality in the new modern world, which is even stranger and farther away from our ancient world than the farming world was. All right, so this problem could plausibly cause a number of maladaptive trends over the last few centuries. Maladaptive from the point of view of cultural evolution. But I want to focus on the one that's the most plausibly maladaptive, which is fertility. Having a species in times of plenty and peace, good times, have below replacement fertility and shrinking population, that's just a pretty clear sign of something being maladaptive in a biological species. And the forecast is that we will probably reach peak population in the world and start declining within roughly 3 decades or so. And that can just continue for several centuries. The proximate causes of these seem to be cultural trends. That is, if you say, why is fertility declining? If you look for the proximate causes, the things that are causing individuals to change their habits and behavior, seems to be things like gender equality, intensive parenting, longer school paths, and early career paths, marriage switching from cornerstone to capstone norms, grandparents having less influence over parenting in kids' lives, more urbanity, less religion. These are the major trends that seem to be causing. And then you might ask, well, why are all these trends going in this direction if it's maladaptive? And the story is these are somewhat random trends, but maybe somewhat forager-like trends as well, causing cultural drift. Now, one thing that many people don't know that I want to make sure that you do understand about a falling population world is it probably becomes less innovative. That is, our standard model of innovation suggests that innovation is roughly proportional to the rate of economic activity. And in an exponentially growing economy, the most recent period of activity is a large percentage of the integral of all activity so far. But in a declining population and a declining economy, the activity in the most recent period is not a substantial fraction of the integral of all activity so far. And therefore, people would see innovation grinding to a halt. We might have several centuries of basically static technology and key innovation. And that plausibly will cut liberality, because plausibly the main reason the world became more liberal over the last few centuries is a few relatively liberal societies were winning in wealth and military power, and all the rest said we have to keep up with that somehow. And they became more liberal to become more innovative so that they would not fall behind as much. And in a world without much innovation, there's not much reason to be liberal then. So there are a number of fixes we can think about with fertility, but if we just think the most likely thing to happen if we do nothing is that we will just be replaced by what are now small, insular, fertile, mostly religious subcultures like the Amish and Haredim. And there's a historical precedent for this, which is basically that the way the Christians took over the Roman Empire was doubling every 20 years for 3 centuries. They started very small, but after 3 centuries of doubling every 20 years, they ended up big and took over. And that can happen to the world today. If our dominant civilization shrinks, then these small, fast-growing subcultures can, over a few centuries, come to dominate. Some people hope that DNA evolution will kick in to save us, but I'm skeptical, and it didn't really happen in past civilizations that declined because of falling fertility. It's possible that human-level AI, if it appears soon enough, could replace human population with robot population and then allow the economy to continue. There's some other approaches I won't bother to go into now that we could use to deal with this, but the key thing to notice is this is a symptom, not the underlying problem. In general, in medicine, it's often good to fix symptoms if that will keep your patient alive long enough to fix their underlying problem. So it would be great to try to fix fertility. But even if we fix fertility, we would still have this underlying problem of cultural drift. So now, in general, I would pose the solution. The problem of cultural drift has, like, analogous to being on a ship heading for an iceberg. There's 2 general classes of solutions. One is to try to get control of the ship's wheel and turn the ship. And the other approach is to get off on lifeboats. So the Amish and Haredim approach is to get off on lifeboats. And if you can't join them, maybe you would think of forming some other small insular culture that could be very fertile. But then if you don't do that, the question is, can you turn the ship of the entire dominant world culture so that it doesn't hit the iceberg? Um, sorry. So what are some of the scenario options here? Now, so if we don't fundamentally fix this problem, say the Amish and Haredim rise in our place, obviously we would lose a lot of things we cherish about our culture. The Amish and Haredim don't value many things we value, but plausibly they would also suffer the same problem as they got large and integrated, because it's a problem with just having a large integrated world culture. And eventually, when we were spread across space, we would be fragmented enough that we would then have guaranteed variety in that form, but that's still a long way off. Um, if you want to try to return stronger selection pressures, obviously one approach is just to have more war, famine, and epidemics sort of thing, but nobody really wants that. But that would presumably succeed in creating stronger selection pressures. Maybe a stronger fertility selection pressure could work. If we get human level AI and we allow them to compete with each other fiercely in a Malthusian world, we would make more stronger selection pressures among the AI. But that would not fix cultural drift per se, because even with stronger selection pressure, they still might not have enough variety. That is, they might just have one big world culture of AIs. Um, is there a way to just move our world culture to something that works better? Many people like this idea of what they call multiculturalism. And if we could have a deep multiculturalism, we could have a lot more cultural variety in the world, and that might help. I don't know if hundreds of thousands of cultures is feasible, but maybe more than our single world monoculture. We certainly need more than, say, the two dominant political cultures, left versus right or something, fight here. That's not enough variety. But it turns out that when people say they like multiculturalism, the thing they like is a variety of songs and clothes and languages and, holidays. They don't actually want deep multiculturalism, i.e., deep attitudes toward gender and war and democracy and death and patriotism, those sorts of things. When people vary in those sorts of values, other people tend to hate it and try to crush them, as opposed to celebrating multiculturalism. So to get deep multiculturalism, we would have to actually tolerate very different attitudes toward deep attitudes in life. Some people toy with the idea of returning to a previous culture, but even if there was energy for that, which I don't see much of it, you'd have to somehow return to a generalization of the previous cultures that worked, because they were embedded in very particular contexts, and we have very different technology, living in cities, all sorts of things today. The question is how you could generalize that. Maybe the world could just become more social Darwinists, eagerly thinking themselves in terms of trying to be culturally adaptive. But as you know, people hate this idea of cultural Darwinism because it's associated with Hitler, and that very idea of cultures competing is illicit in our world today. We could perhaps try to deculture in the sense of moving more behavior away from this high level of things we have to share down to sorts of areas where we would allow them to be different. And I have many ideas for social institutions. They could say, make medicine and law and other sorts of things depend less on status, which is one of the key ways that we share culture. We have sharing status markers. Plausibly, it would work actually to try to go to a full capitalism, where capitalism ran parenting through for-profit orphanages, capitalism ran governments. If capitalism really had a strong for-profit competition and ran most of our culture, then that would probably work, but most people hate that idea. So the solution I want to end our discussion here with is going to be a long shot and unlikely. Therefore, my overall description is we are in deep trouble. Humanity has broken its superpower, and it looks really hard to fix. But let me now at least outline something that plausibly could work if enough things go right. So, as you know, now, one solution might be just strong nationalist competition, which did seem to be on the table roughly a century ago. But remember, there weren't really nations before 2 centuries ago. So the rise of national competition is a new thing. And then in the last century, it seems to have faded, and people now have more allegiance to world elite communities than they do their particular nation. But in principle, we could manage to sort of hand this problem of cultural drift to a functional government, the one that was actually competent enough to solve things. Then that might solve the problem by sort of at the meta level handing the problem to a competent party. As unfortunately, as you know, government up until now, mostly in the world, has not been very competent, and that's why many of us say that they should not be doing as many things as they are because they just can't handle it. They're just not good at most of them. But if in fact we had a more competent form of government, then you'll have to change your mind and maybe be more willing to hand tasks to government. All right, so the more competent form of governance that I'm going to suggest actually exists is something I've called futarchy. I actually first started posting on it almost 30 years ago. And here's the key idea. So imagine we have a key decision, say keep the CEO or not in a company, and then we have a key metric for the organization, the stock price, which says we want to make this decision to increase the stock price. So that's the key thing we need here in this governance mechanism of futarchy. We need a market asset that represents the expected value of what we want in the company so that we can say we want this asset to go up. That's what we want as an organization. And then we need a discrete decision, get rid of the CEO or keep them, say, because our key mechanism is going to make decision conditional prices. So this in the diagram, you can have the price of the company up until some key decision moment. And then we're going to create two different prices. The price of the company if we keep the CEO and the price of the company if we dump the CEO, i.e. a yes or a no price. And when we measure this price over a period, we will see which price is higher, and then we will do whatever that says. So if it says the company is worth more if we keep the CEO, then we keep the CEO. If it's worth more if we dump, then we dump. And that's the key governance mechanism here, which I've called decision markets or futarchy, asking a speculative market to estimate the consequence of a decision. And there are just straightforward ways to have decision conditional prices. Basically, you call off a trade if a condition isn't met, and that gives you decision conditional prices because the speculators, when trading in a called off market, will only consider the scenarios consistent with the condition that's the condition of the market, because otherwise the trade doesn't happen. Right now, this idea was actually invented by somebody, not me. Apparently in 1981, somebody made a business based on this, made some money, and then quit a few years later and has been an investor since then. But apparently nobody really tried the idea based on that. And then I reinvented the idea in 1996 after 7 years later, sort of being the founder of the field of prediction markets, as they say, or a founder. In 2022, a secretive India-based government agency started to experiment with this. And then in 23, a finance company called the MetaDAO has been trying it out. They've done roughly 70 proposals where they basically say anybody can make a proposal how to change our organization. 70 have been made. And then they have a market, as I just discussed, to decide whether to approve each proposal. And this organization has been greatly increasing in value since then. And they now have a dozen customer firms who are also trying to use this method. And then in the last year or so, a number of other firms have started trying to use this method. So finally, after 30 years, my idea is being tried. And so now I ask you to imagine that we continue to succeed in these small scale trials. It continues to work. It continues to generalize to other new applications, not just the places it was tried. And then maybe we could get larger scale governance units to adopt this form of governance, where the slogan is vote on values, but bet on beliefs. We would have some more traditional process for deciding what outcome metric we care about, that we make an asset tied to that, and then we use this mechanism to decide which policies to adopt. Now, that's not going to be enough, unfortunately. So with this mechanism that I described, with a competent form of governance, you could hand it the task of preventing cultural drift and say, hey, solve our problem. Unfortunately, I don't think that'll work because as soon as it started to solve our problem, it would ask sacrifices of us. It would make big changes. And we would go, oh, we don't like that. That looks like too much trouble. And then we'd change the goal. I don't think people would feel very attached to the goal of preventing civilization decline. It's not something that actually digs deep into them emotionally. They would just rather let it decline and have a happy life. That's exactly why civilization is declining. People have decided to make choices that give them happy lives today instead of caring about the future of civilization. But there is this thing called the sacred. So a couple of years ago, I realized it was in my way. I didn't understand it. So I spent a year trying to understand and study the sacred. And the point is, in the end, I realized that there is a model that makes sense of it. I drew on previous literatures and I collected 68 correlates of the sacred and collapsed those into 7 themes and found a standard previous theory by a guy named Durkheim, explained 3 of them, and I could explain the other 4 if I invoked a concept from construal level theory about how we see things from afar versus close. For the purposes of this talk, the main point is that the sacred exists, and we have 2 key attitudes toward the sacred. One is first of all, we like sharing sacred goals. People like having a sacred goal that their community has together. They like to pursue a goal together that they see as sacred. When they have such a sacred goal, they are proud to sacrifice for it, and they are ashamed to abandon it. And that's the key mechanism that I hope to draw on. I asked a bunch of polls on Twitter, and I asked what sort of a sacred goal or a deep goal could you imagine people like you or people in your community actually getting behind and having a long-term commitment to. And top of the list were goals like, when do 1 million people live off of space? Or when do we achieve physical immortality? Those are goals that people could actually get behind. They could emotionally feel that they really wanted that they were bound together by a community that supported that they were together pursuing that. And then in that case, they would in fact be proud to sacrifice it for it and ashamed to abandon it. And so that's my proposed cultural fix here. And this is my lab. And we're going to open up the discussions as soon as I review here. So the key idea is humanity has this deep problem. We broke our superpower. There's 2 levels of evolution. There's the evolution of cultures, evolution in cultures. We drastically reduce variety, selection pressures. We have a faster change of environment, more random eagerness to change culture. All of that means that the process of having the cloud of cultural points track the adaptive region is going badly at the level of cultures. And in order to solve that, I've went through a number of ways we could try to increase variety or selection pressure, et cetera. None of them seem very satisfactory. The best thing I can come up with, which I admit isn't very good or isn't very likely, is to hand the problem to a competent government and say, here's the problem, fix it. And a way we could do that, if we had a competent form of governance, which I propose that we do in the form of futarchy, which is now being tested, but then that's not enough. We'd have to hand it a sacred goal that we had felt committed to, that we would then not abandon when it asked for sacrifices. And that would have to be a goal that happens to be inconsistent with civilization collapse. Not every goal will work. Say the goal of protecting the environment doesn't work because civilization collapse could protect the environment just fine. But some goals are inconsistent with civilization collapse, and those, if we were committed to them, would then prevent collapse if we, in fact, gave a competent governance that goal and then let it persist. Now, both of these, there are 2 key aspects of this that are actually a stretch from even what we know how to do with futarchy so far. One is that we just haven't been in the practice of managing cultures with governance mechanisms. As I said, corporations do a bad job of that at the moment. So one good practice here would be to try now to use this sort of governance mechanism to help manage corporate cultures. If we could get experience at that, that gives us the idea that maybe we could help manage more macro cultures. And the other thing is most of the futarchy is based on relatively short-term goals, and it's just harder to have a governance mechanism that pursues long-term goals, and that's what we kind of need for this application. So there are applications of futarchy to longer-term goals that we should be pursuing now just to get into the habit of trying to have governance mechanisms that pursue long-term goals. Anyway, that's my talk. I don't hear anything though.
Robin, it's Garth here. You told me this was your current passion, and so you put a lot into it. Is there any place where you've drawn it all together in one spot, like a book or
I'm working on a book, but I have a number of blog posts that are on the topic. One of them is called Our Big Oops. And then I have an essay on the cultural phrase, cultural drift. But yes, I'm working on a book on this at the moment, but you guys get to hear it ahead of time.
Super. Okay, you're open for questions?
Yes, please. Absolutely. Yeah. And comments and objections.
Yeah.
Where can we start with nationalism?
I didn't hear that.
Where can we start with nationalism? Oh, did he
Well-
say where?
It's weird.
Where, sorry, where can we
Where?
start with no?
It's called how.
So
Where,
How?
if you mean, could you start to revive nationalism? That is, look, like 3 centuries ago, you had empires and subjects. You did not really have nationalism. You didn't really have people emotionally committed to a nation and trying to promote a national culture and unit. That arose from, say, 1800 to 1900 was the rise of the nation state, first in France and elsewhere around the world. And then for a while, we had somewhat strong allegiance to nations, as in world wars. But since then, the allegiance to the nation is just way down. We instead have most people who are elites in the world have more of an allegiance to international elite communities than they do their particular nation. So somehow you would have to revive nationalism, which again was never that big a thing. It was only a thing roughly a century or so ago, and it appeared and then went away. So it would work if much of the world could become much more tied to nations, and then nations would compete. But obviously, for example, you would need the elites of a nation to have their primary allegiance be to the nation and to be focused on how they could promote their nation. That was a thing for a short period. It is no longer. You'd have to somehow revive that.
Hi, Robin, what can you hear me?
I prefer green.
Green, yeah, hello. Robin, what a delightful topic. I'm just listening to everything you spoke about. I have a question. What do you think about the premise that the industrial style education system has single-handedly caused the cultural drift over the past 170 years? And I ask this because I feel there's a very copy-paste kind of formula across the Western world with regards to how education is approached. So you have millions, billions of kids learning pretty much the same stuff. But besides that, a school is a very unnatural environment. So you take a child out of the home, thrust them into a Lord of the Flies situation, and then we wonder why society collapses. And I find from the child's perspective, a parent is the bridge between the child and the community. So that's why, just with everything you were saying, it just occurred to me, perhaps what we have to blame is the industrial education system, and perhaps the solution to finding a new multinational global culture is actually a complete breaking down of any kind of state-sponsored schooling system and creating rather far out eccentric learning centers where kids can explore adventure and be more in touch with the community in some way or the other. The exact blueprint or solution, I don't know, but just I'd love to hear your thoughts on the premise that the education system has single-handedly caused the cultural drift in the past 2 centuries.
Right. So we should make a clear distinction between diagnosing what went wrong and figuring out how to fix it now. So, for example, this perspective I've given you says that conservatives through history who have said you're changing stuff too fast, you don't know what you're doing, those people were right. But that doesn't mean doing what they say now will help. And similarly, your diagnosis is right in the sense that it's clear in the rise of the nation state that public schooling was a central element of the rise of the nation state. It was causally there. It was a central factor in causing the decline of peasant culture, and the rise of national culture was national promoted schooling. And in our world today, a big factor in causing the global monoculture has been elites sharing, say, going to the same colleges, the same elite colleges around the world. Elite merging of cultures worldwide in the last century has also been directly facilitated a lot by global shared education. And as I said, plausibly the rise of the rapid pace of youth cultures and youth movements was directly caused by the rise of high school and college. So as a diagnosis, you're right, education has been central in causing this process. But now the question is, okay, but does that somehow going against that solve the problem? So just like the fact that we've changed culture so much against the conservatives' advice that they said you're changing stuff too fast, you don't know what we're doing. They were right, but now that we're here, conservative culture also changed a lot since where it was. So it's not obvious that doing what they say helps now. And so even if we were to turn off a lot of government funding of school now, I think we would just get a lot of private funded school, including the elite universities of the world, which would still continue to enforce a global culture. I think we'd have to go farther than merely defunding public school in order to reverse the effect that public school has had over the last 3 centuries. Unfortunately, we've really screwed things up, and it's hard to just undo what we did to fix it.
Are you ready for the next question?
Yes, please.
Okay. Have you got any thoughts on what role currencies play as a cultural artifact?
I'm an economist, and I know that just a lot of people get really obsessed with money as a cultural force or a economic force, and we economists just don't think it is. Neither do most other social scientists. Money just isn't that powerful a force compared to its prominence in public imagination. Most everything can go on pretty much the same, even with different kinds of money, different forms of money, etc. It's the economy mostly that matters, and the society and culture that matter. The particular forms of money, don't matter so much. I mean, there might be ways we could make them better, and that would be good. But the first thing to say is they just are far less important than most people seem to think.
Good to know.
Hello, my name's Judy Saul. I'm just asking you, at the moment we seem to have a very strong, powerful globalist group who trying to do exactly the opposite of nationalization. But they're determined to somehow take away our humanity and have us digitized, which is a very strong no-no for most people who understand that. But on the opposite, how about an idea that is completely different, community of communities, which I think a little bit of what Lauren was talking about, where the idea of living in harmony with nature is the predominant feature. And so basically we function as part of a community of life, and everybody, at least your basic substructure, which is your production of your food, and the culture that will probably emerge from doing it together, is going to be the predominant feature. Does that bring about sufficient variety of the same kind that nationalism would? Because nationalism with a government, which we've never had a success with, governments are always corrupt, and they always are just a means of other people getting control. And we've got to learn to accept our own sovereignty. So we'd like to think that there is a possibility for a community of communities globally, and an idea of living in harmony with nature.
So I didn't see you there, but I did hear you because you're just off the camera screen here. But nice to meet you, a stranger who I can't see. So if you look at, say, the literature on the fall of the Roman Empire or things like that, there's just this huge range of theories that people offer, because it does look like people take whatever they don't like about their culture and then they want to use it to blame the decline of ancient cultures and the decline of the current culture. So there's a lot of people today who see our culture, dominant culture, as somewhat in decline or sick, and then they have a wide range of things they want to blame it on, mostly things they don't like. So I am saying that civilization is in decline and culture is in decline, but I have a much more specific theory here of the mechanism of the cause, and it's going to support some claims of things you don't like, but not necessarily others. So you're saying you'd like more, connection to nature, more respect for nature, etc. That has been a change in culture over the last few centuries. Definitely respect for nature has greatly increased, and plausibly that's something that goes with a forager trend. That is, foragers were, in fact, more respectful of nature than farmers were. But I don't have any particular reason to expect that if we are more in tune with nature, respectful of nature, that would solve cultural drift. I just don't see a connection there. That is, I don't even see more variety as a result of that. People who like and respect nature worldwide are not more diverse and fragmented in their culture. That seems to be an integration effect. That is, the world of people who respect and love nature have drawn people around the world together as part of the world elite community that does respect and love nature. I'm not saying nature is bad and you shouldn't love and respect it. I'm just saying that I just don't see how that solves the problem I'm pointing to here in particular. But I'm not saying it's bad either. A fundamental problem here is culture has changed in a lot of ways over the last few centuries, and I'm certainly not saying they were all bad. The problem is it looks like on average many of them were bad, enough to take us down, and that's our problem. How do we figure out how to fix this process problem? The idea that we could just go through all the elements of culture and try to figure out which were good and bad and reverse those, I think is a pretty daunting task, because I just think it's going to be really hard to figure out what are all the things that are good or bad. Sorry, should I realize my face isn't showing. I should have ended the slideshow here thing. I guess I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. And then now you can see my face. Sorry. I wasn't trying to be rude. I didn't realize I wasn't showing my face.
Very fascinating talk. Made me think more than I've thought about before. What do you think of Fukuyama, End of History? He sort of predicted that all cultures would end in one bland, uniform, capitalist sort of social democracy. And it hasn't happened, quite the opposite.
Right. So there's two separate claims, one of which is that everything will converge and then we'll all have the same culture. And then a separate claim is that will be naturally the best one. I believe Fukuyama is making both claims, both that cultures are converging and it's converging on the naturally best one. And of course, if there was a naturally best one, our convergence on it would not be very disturbing or problematic. That would be great. The problem is if there's this vast space of possible cultures and we are converging together to be the same, but not to the best thing. And in fact, the thing we're converging on is just drifting away from the best. That's the scenario I'm presenting here and saying, yes, the world is merging to share culture, but it's mostly by, a conformity effect by which we all want to be more similar to each other, and we are becoming more similar to each other, and that makes for a more convergent world culture, but not obviously because the thing we're converging on is actually the best.
Well, since we're following an evolutionary approach, does it matter and have we the ability to affect the outcome? Just like a particular gene can't drive the total of evolution. What is.
We are part of a process, and we can influence the process we are part of. But it has these two elements. There's the DNA evolution process, and then there's the cultural evolution process. And people, when they think of evolutionary, tend to focus on the DNA, but for most of human history, it's been the culture that's been the dominant force. Culture is where human natural selection is. But we compete, for example, in cultural natural selection. That is, cultures compete with each other. You as individuals compete in the world for cultural influence and descendants. So there is certainly potential of influence here by consciously making choices. That is, look, humans have the ability to consciously analyze their behavior and their choices, and that's a power we have that many other animals don't have. And on average, we've had it because it has actually helped us to win out in competition in the world. Our ability to consciously think and analyze has been one of humanity's powers that lets us win and do better. But we haven't been applying it to this area of culture very much. That is, culture we mostly intuitively inherit and just go along with without consciously thinking about which culture we want and which one is better. It's going to be hard to get in that habit because we are not in that habit, but certainly, we are here talking in that mode. We are saying, let's think about the situation we're in and what could we do. Another thing you might say, though, is why should I care? As long as there are some descendants who inherit from us, doesn't matter what cultural features they have, or is it inevitable if there's going to be some later set of cultural features that are going to win? We can't influence which ones those are, so why try? So those would be variations on what you said. They aren't, no, we can't influence in terms of we can't have local action, but maybe we can't affect the final outcome. I'd say that natural selection seems to produce enough variety that there isn't a single natural endpoint to natural selection. So if you look in the biological world around us, there's no like canonical animal or plant or something. Like there's a huge variety of plants and animals. And it looks like that's plausibly the endpoint of cultural evolution, is a lot of variety that isn't all predetermined by sort of the environment or the process. And so we have hope that we could preserve some of the things we care about. So I would say the agenda is this. First, you have to care about the future somehow. If you don't care about the future, then you don't care about where natural selection goes in the future, and then you don't care about any of this, right? Just live your life and enjoy, and that's all you care about, right? If you care about the long run, though, the long run's going to be adaptive, and you might say, well, if it's going to be convergent on some sort of adaptive thing that we can't control, then again, who cares about the long run? So I'm saying, no, the long run isn't fully determined, but it's determined in the following way. Whatever lasts in the long run will have to be tied to a lot of pretty adaptive stuff. So if there's anything you want to last in the long run, you'll need to tie it to an adaptive package. If you just make packages of stuff that are not very adaptive, they will just go away and they'll be lost. So you're a package of stuff. Your culture is a package of stuff. You like some of it. Look, all the favorite movies you've ever seen or the favorite songs you've ever read or novels, they're all from our culture. They all represent what we are and what we like in contrast to other cultures that have existed in history and probably could exist in the future. If there's something about our culture that you like, then you should be sad if it goes away, if it goes extinct. But in order to save anything that we are, you'll need to make most of what we are be adaptive. You'll have to compromise. You can't have everything that you are and just stick with it that way. You'll have to give up on a lot of what you are to save a few things that you are. So that first ask, what's most precious to you? And then how can you let the other things become more adaptive so that the thing that's most precious to you can last and survive? So for me, that's open inquiry. Open inquiry is precious to me. Most societies in history haven't valued it very highly. The Amish and Haredim, who plausibly could replace us, they don't value it very highly. So this thing that I most value is being threatened. It will plausibly go away unless we can turn the ship of world culture to become more adaptive, or maybe make a lifeboat culture that happens to embody it. That's how I see what I care about. I can only save a few things from our culture, because if I try to save everything, it all goes down because the whole package seems to be pretty maladaptive. So what parts do I most cherish? How can I tie those with other adaptive things is the way I say
Thanks very much, Robin.
Thank you all. And enjoy the rest of your evening. I know I'm your last stop on the schedule, so you go out to dinner, whatever you're going to do, enjoy.
You too. I'll be in touch.
Thanks.
So, Rudy, then we will finish.
No, just seeing. I mean, what a good ending.
And anyone who still hasn't given me their voting.
Thank you.
Thanks.